Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into why Britain industrialized first, and I want you to hold on to one provocative idea from the very start. The Industrial Revolution was not just a parade of clever inventions, it was a giant systems shift powered by energy, incentives, institutions, and a whole lot of unintended consequences. In this video, we are going to trace how a stubborn old problem, the limits of an economy running on wood, food, and muscle, gets shattered when coal becomes cheap enough to matter, and when transport networks make that energy usable at scale. We will also unpack a sneaky economic clue that sounds boring until you realize it changes everything: the relationship between wages and energy prices. Because when labor is expensive and energy is cheap, machines stop being futuristic toys and start being profitable decisions. Then we will zoom out and ask the bigger questions that make historians and economists argue at dinner parties. How much did laws, property rights, and credible rules shape long-term investment? How did knowledge networks turn tinkering into transformation? And what happens when growth is tied to power, global trade, and moral compromise? And by the end, I want you thinking like a detective, not a cheerleader, because the real story is not Britain was destined, it is Britain had a rare alignment, and once those gears caught, they pulled the world into a new era, whether it was ready or not. Now, take a breath, because we are about to rewind to Britain before the breakthrough, back when none of this felt inevitable. Before we get dazzled by steam engines and spinning machines, we have to picture Britain in the century or so before the fireworks, roughly 1650 to 1750, when the country is already changing, just not in the dramatic, smokestack way people imagine. Britain is commercial, increasingly urban, and surprisingly connected for its time, with ports feeding trade, rivers acting like medieval highways, and London becoming a gravitational center of money, information, and ambition. But here's the key: this is not yet an industrial economy, it is an economy stretching within older limits, where most people still live close to the land, most production happens in small workshops or homes, and growth tends to bump into constraints that feel almost natural, like a ceiling you can touch. And it is worth saying out loud, Britain was not automatically the obvious winner of history's race at this stage. Parts of Europe are wealthy and sophisticated, and in many categories Britain is a strong contender, not an unmatched champion. So the real question is not how did the richest place get richer, but how did a society that was still mostly pre-industrial put together the ingredients for an explosion? That is why this period matters, because you can already see the pressure building: more people, more trade, more demand, more specialization, and you can also see the old bottlenecks tightening: energy, transport costs, and the sheer difficulty of scaling production without turning everything into a logistical nightmare. Imagine trying to feed a growing city when the entire system depends on fields, forests, and muscle power. It is like trying to run a modern data center on candles. You can make progress, but it is slow, and every step forward comes with friction. So when we say before the breakthrough, we mean a society on the edge of possibility, dynamic enough to want more, connected enough to try new methods, and constrained enough that when a true escape route appears, it will be seized with almost desperate intensity. Now we arrive at one of those ideas that sounds academic until it snaps the whole story into focus: the organic economy constraint, which is a fancy way of saying that for most of human history, economic life ran on biological energy. Wood for heat, food for people, feed for animals, and muscle power to move things and make things. And here's the trap: land is the bottleneck behind all of it. Land grows the food, land grows the timber, land supports the animals, and land is limited. So even when societies become more organized, more skilled, more commercial, they keep slamming into the same ceiling. You can only squeeze so much energy out of fields and forests before prices rise, forests thin out, and the cost of living climbs. That is why long-run growth used to feel like a treadmill. Productivity gains often turned into more people rather than permanently higher living standards, because population growth pushes demand back up against the land constraint. So when you hear that the Industrial Revolution was about machines, you should mentally translate it into something deeper. It was about escaping an energy regime. Because if your energy comes from living things, the math is cruel. You can work harder, trade more, innovate a bit, but you are still budgeting in a world where energy is expensive, bulky, seasonal, and limited by acreage. And that shapes everything: wages, prices, and which inventions are worth pursuing. Ask yourself a simple question: if heating a furnace or powering a pump costs a fortune in scarce fuel, why would you build an economy that depends on hot furnaces and powerful pumps? You wouldn't unless you found a way to make energy cheap, reliable, and scalable. That is the punchline of this slide. The most important technological story is not just the machines people built, but the energy constraint they broke. Once an economy finds a way to tap a massive, non-biological energy source, suddenly you can do things that were previously irrational, like running high-temperature industrial processes routinely, or powering machinery independent of wind, water, or muscle. So keep this in mind as we move forward. Britain's firstness is deeply connected to the moment it stops acting like an organic economy and starts behaving like something new, an economy that can finally afford to burn its way past the old ceiling. Alright, here is where the story gets wonderfully concrete, because history is not just ideas floating in the air, it is rocks in the ground and boats on the water. Britain had coal, and not just in the abstract sense of a country possesses a resource, but coal that was often relatively accessible and, crucially, positioned in ways that made it cheap to deliver where it mattered. That last part is everything. A lump of coal sitting underground is not an industrial revolution, it is a potential. What turns it into power is delivered cost, meaning how cheaply you can get energy from the seam to the furnace, the mill, the city, the port. Britain's geography helps here. Many coalfields are not hopelessly isolated from economic centres, and Britain has navigable rivers, a long coastline, and later a growing network of canals that make heavy transport dramatically more affordable than dragging fuel over rough roads. So you get this compounding effect. Coal becomes not just available, but usable at scale, and the moment you can move heavy materials cheaply, you can also move other heavy things cheaply: iron, clay, textiles, grain. Suddenly industry can cluster, specialize, and expand without choking on transport costs. And coal does not just warm homes. Coal is cheap heat for industrial processes, it is the fuel behind steam power, and it supports advances in metallurgy because high temperature, consistent heat is exactly what you need for smelting and refining. Think of it like this: if an economy is a body, energy is oxygen. You can have brilliant ideas and strong muscles, but without abundant oxygen, you cannot sprint. Coal is Britain's oxygen tank, and transport is the hose that connects it. And here's a subtle implication that often gets missed: when energy becomes cheaper and more reliable, it changes the menu of what entrepreneurs and inventors even consider possible. You start building systems that assume heat and power are on demand. You start redesigning production around machines rather than hands. You start doing processes at a scale that would have bankrupted an earlier generation. So this slide is basically shouting one message in a polite academic voice: Britain's coal mattered because geography and transport networks made that coal economically actionable, and once the cost of energy falls in the right places, the rest of the industrial story has somewhere to plug in. Now we get to one of my favorite clues in this whole mystery, because it feels like economics homework until you realize it explains why certain inventions show up in certain places. The argument here is simple and powerful. Britain experienced relatively high wages at the same time it had relatively cheap energy, and that combination is like a giant neon sign pointing inventors toward labor-saving machines. Think about it in everyday terms. If workers are expensive, every hour of human effort you can replace becomes money saved. And if energy is cheap, powering a machine becomes affordable. So what looks like genius inventors changing the world can also be read as people responding to prices, because prices tell you what problems are worth solving. When labor is cheap, employers can just hire more hands and keep doing things the old way. But when labor is costly, suddenly it becomes profitable to invest in equipment that can do the job faster, longer, and with fewer people. That is what economists call induced innovation, but you can call it common sense with a calculator. And this helps explain why mechanization in textiles, pumping, and factory processes accelerates in Britain. A spinning machine or a powered loom is not just a cool gadget, it is a response to a real cost pressure, a way to substitute capital and energy for labor. The same logic shows up in mining. If you need to pump water out of mines and human or animal power is costly and limited, then a steam engine starts to look less like a fantasy and more like a solution. So here is the big takeaway of this slide. Britain did not industrialize first just because it had smart people. Everyone has smart people. It industrialized first because its economic environment made certain kinds of smart solutions pay off. The wage structure and the energy price structure created incentives, and incentives are like gravity, they pull behavior in predictable directions. And once a few firms start successfully using machines to cut labor costs, competitors feel pressure to follow, and then you get that famous cascade where a new method becomes the new normal. So the next time someone tells you the Industrial Revolution was an accident of a few inventors, ask them a quiet question: why did these machines become widespread here, at this time, instead of remaining curiosities? The answer often lives in the unglamorous world of wages, fuel prices, and the cold logic of profitability. Now let's talk about something that sounds like paperwork but behaves like rocket fuel: property rights and credible commitment. Because even if you have coal, and even if machines would be profitable, you still need one more ingredient to get an industrial takeoff: confidence. Confidence that if you invest a fortune in a new mill, a canal, a mine, or a weird experimental engine, the rules will not suddenly shift and vaporize your returns. That is what people mean by credible commitment: the idea that the state's behavior becomes predictable enough that investors believe contracts will be enforced, confiscation is unlikely, and long-term deals actually mean something. After the political upheavals around the late 17th century, Britain develops institutions that many scholars argue made government promises more believable, which matters because industrialization is expensive and slow. You are tying up capital in fixed equipment, buildings, and infrastructure that you cannot easily move if politics goes bad. So predictable rules lower the risk premium, and when risk premiums fall, more investment becomes viable. You can see how this connects to finance too. When investors trust the system, credit markets deepen, and that means entrepreneurs can borrow, expand, and scale. And I want to be fair here: historians debate how decisive this institutional shift was and how to measure better institutions, but the mechanism is clear enough to appreciate: when rules are stable, experimentation gets cheaper. When rules are arbitrary, people invest in hiding wealth, not building factories. And here's the part that quietly ties back to power: institutions are not neutral. They can protect voluntary exchange and reward productive effort, or they can concentrate privileges and redirect wealth toward insiders. So as we think about Britain, the question is not just did the state step back, it is did the system become predictable enough to let long-term investment flourish, because industrialization is a long game. It is canals and mills and machines that take years to pay off. And in a world where policy can change overnight, who would bet their life savings on a machine? But in a world where rights are clearer and commitments are more credible, suddenly the future becomes investable, and that is when innovation stops being a hobby and starts becoming an industry. Now, even with cheap energy and the right incentives, you still need something else: a way for ideas to spread, mutate, and improve without being trapped in one genius's notebook. This is where knowledge networks and what some historians call useful ideas enter the stage. Britain in this era is not just a place with inventors, it is a place with dense connections between people who tinker, people who measure, people who build, and people who finance. Think about workshops, apprenticeships, dissenting academies, scientific societies, coffeehouse conversations, and a growing print culture that lets practical knowledge travel. It is like an early version of open source culture, except the code is how to make better pumps, stronger iron, more reliable gears, and faster looms. And what matters here is not just abstract science, but a cultural respect for improvement: the idea that you can take a process, measure it, tweak it, and make it consistently better. That mindset turns innovation into a habit rather than a miracle, and it helps solve a huge problem: scaling. A clever prototype is impressive, but it becomes historically transformative only when thousands of people can copy it, adapt it, and integrate it into everyday production. Networks make that possible. They also connect theory to practice, because someone might have a scientific insight, but it takes skilled craftsmen and engineers to turn that insight into a machine that does not break every 2 days. So you get a feedback loop: improvements spread, improvements create profits, profits fund more experimentation, and experimentation generates more improvements. And here is the subtle point that keeps this honest: ideas do not float above reality. They land where conditions allow them to grow. A society can have brilliant ideas, but if energy is scarce or incentives are wrong, those ideas remain curiosities. Britain's advantage is that these useful ideas had the right soil, a world where adopting them could actually pay. So when you picture Britain's industrial awakening, do not imagine a single lightning bolt. Imagine a buzzing ecosystem of problem solvers sharing tricks, arguing, measuring, building, failing, and trying again. And because the system rewards improvements, those small advances accumulate into something that looks, from a distance, like a sudden revolution. Now we zoom out from inventors and institutions to something that sounds ordinary but changes everything: markets, specialization, and scale. Because even if you can build a machine, you still need enough buyers, enough suppliers, and enough coordination to make mass production worth the trouble. Britain benefits from growing towns and a relatively integrated internal market, helped by improving transport, so goods, people, and information move more easily than in many places. And when markets get bigger, something almost magical happens: the division of labor deepens. Instead of one person doing a little of everything, You get specialists doing one task extremely well, which raises productivity, lowers unit costs, and encourages standardization. This is the logic behind factories, not just a building full of machines, but a system that organizes work so repetition becomes efficiency. And here's where the cause and effect starts to compound. Larger markets allow specialization. Specialization lowers costs. Lower costs make goods affordable to more people. More buyers expand the market further. And suddenly you have this self-reinforcing loop where growth feeds growth. It is like a snowball that only starts rolling once the slope is steep enough. And transport is part of this story too, because an integrated market is not just a political map, it is a cost map. If it is expensive to move goods, then your market stays local and your scale stays small. But when transport costs fall, producers can sell farther, suppliers can feed larger operations, and firms can justify bigger investments in fixed capital. So you should picture Britain as building an economic engine with many moving parts, markets that connect regions, specialization that increases output, and scale that makes mechanization worthwhile. And the quiet moral question hovering behind this is, who gets to participate in these expanding markets and who gets pushed aside by the new scale of production? Because the same system that creates abundance can also restructure communities and concentrate power, depending on how entry, competition, and privilege are handled. But on this slide, the core takeaway is straightforward. Britain's industrial rise is not just invention. It is a market environment big enough and connected enough to turn invention into a new normal. Now we step onto the global stage, because Britain's industrial story is not confined to its island shores. Empire and trade matter here, partly because they expand markets and partly because they reshape incentives. When producers have access to wider demand, especially through Atlantic trade routes and colonial markets, they have a stronger reason to scale up production. A workshop that serves a local town can stay small, but a producer supplying far larger networks starts thinking in terms of volume, standardization, and consistent output. Ports become arteries, shipping becomes infrastructure, and commercial expansion creates opportunities that a purely local economy would never present. But here we also have to do something intellectually honest. We have to separate contribution from causation, because historians debate how central empire and slavery profits were to Britain's industrial takeoff. There were real connections, trade generated wealth, certain sectors benefited, and global markets helped absorb growing output. But the question is how decisive these channels were compared to energy costs, wages, institutions, and domestic dynamics. And this is where the moral accounting comes in, because even if a system produces growth, we still have to ask how that growth was financed and who bore the costs. If commercial expansion is tied to coercion, monopoly privileges, or forced labor, then progress becomes morally complicated, not just economically impressive. So I want you to sit with that tension. On one hand, global trade can spread ideas, goods, and prosperity. On the other hand, when trade is entangled with power and exploitation, it can also concentrate gains and externalize suffering. And you can hear the systemic theme again: incentives matter. If a political system grants privileged access, protected routes, or exclusive rights, then profits can flow not only from better production, but from control over markets and people. So the point of this slide is not a simplistic verdict, but a sharper lens. Britain's industrial rise unfolded inside a global web of trade and empire. And understanding that web forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between wealth, power, and human dignity. Now let's talk about the state, not as a cartoon villain or a heroic savior, but as a force that reshapes incentives, channels resources, and often creates consequences no one planned. Britain in this period is deeply involved in wars, and wars are expensive. So you see the growth of taxation and public debt, which can sound dry until you realize what it does to an economy's bloodstream. On one side, the ability to raise revenue and borrow can fund naval power and protection of shipping, which can reinforce commercial expansion and make certain investments feel safer. And in some interpretations, credible government borrowing helps deepen financial markets, creating more capital and more ways to mobilize savings. But here is the catch: every system of finance and policy also creates distortions. Heavy taxation changes behavior. Debt commitments shape future budgets. Wartime needs can redirect innovation toward military priorities rather than consumer welfare. And once a government becomes skilled at borrowing, that skill can become a temptation, because it allows costs to be shifted across time, away from the immediate moment of decision. That is where unintended outcomes sneak in, because policies designed to solve a short-term strategic problem can create long-term burdens, new interest groups, and new forms of rent-seeking. Think of it like building a powerful engine and then realizing it comes with a steering wheel that pulls toward whoever controls the levers. When money and power concentrate around war finance, people begin competing not only by producing better goods, but by gaining influence over policy. So this slide is asking you to notice a pattern that repeats across history. Systems built for coordination can also become systems of dependency, and tools meant for survival can reshape a society's incentives in ways that outlast the original crisis. In Britain's case, the relationship between war, taxation, and debt intersects with industrial development in complicated ways, supporting certain structures while also planting seeds of future tensions. The mature view is not that the state caused industrialization or blocked it, but that it altered the terrain, and when the terrain changes, so do the paths people take. Now comes the comparison slide, and this is where we resist the lazy story that Britain was simply more brilliant than everyone else. The better question is, what constraints were binding in different places, and why did Britain's particular mix break open first? Take the Netherlands, for example, commercially sophisticated, financially advanced, and deeply involved in trade. But if the key bottleneck is energy at scale, then commercial brilliance alone is not enough if fuel is costly or if the energy base cannot expand cheaply in the right locations. Then look at France, a major power with talent and industry, but often facing different structures of internal fragmentation, policy constraints, and varying cost conditions that change the payoff to mechanization. And then China, which had immense population, advanced crafts, and major regional economies, yet operated under different factor prices and resource delivery costs that shaped what kinds of technologies were profitable to adopt widely. The point is not to reduce these societies to a single weakness, it is to think like a systems analyst. If wages are lower relative to energy, then labor-saving machinery is less financially urgent. If energy is expensive or hard to deliver, then steam power is less attractive. If markets are less integrated by transport or policy, scaling becomes harder. And here is another concept worth holding tightly: path dependence. Once one region begins compounding advantages, learning by doing, clustering skills, building supply chains, and standardizing processes, it becomes harder for others to catch up quickly because the leader is not standing still. Early gains create networks, and networks create momentum. So this slide's big message is that Britain's takeoff was not a universal inevitability of human progress. It was a rare alignment of energy accessibility, economic incentives, market conditions, and institutional structures that made a particular set of innovations pay off, and once those innovations began spreading, the process fed on itself. In other words, it is not that others lacked intelligence, it is that Britain's constraints loosened in the right order at the right time. Now we have to sit with the human reality of what all this transformation actually did, because an industrial revolution is not just a chart going up, it is lives being rearranged. On the upside, productivity rises, goods become cheaper, and over time many people gain access to products and comforts that were once luxuries. You also see enormous shifts in global power as industrial capacity becomes a strategic advantage. But that is only half the picture, because the costs were real, immediate, and often brutal. Rapid urbanization means cities swelling faster than housing, sanitation, and public health can keep up. Factory work introduces a new discipline of time, repetition, and supervision that feels very different from earlier rhythms of labor. Working conditions can be harsh, dangerous, and exhausting, and child labor becomes part of the grim arithmetic of household survival in many cases. And then there is the environment, because cheap energy and industrial heat produce smoke, waste, and pollution, making the physical landscape of progress look and smell like something people at the time often described as hellish. And yet, even here, it is important to remember agency, because people were not simply crushed by a machine called history. Entrepreneurs took risks, workers organized, reformers campaigned, communities adapted, and political struggles over labor conditions and social policy emerged precisely because the new system created new pressures. So the honest takeaway of this slide is that industrialization created both abundance and upheaval, both opportunity and exploitation, and it forced societies to renegotiate what they considered acceptable in work, family life, and public responsibility. The moral tension is not a side note, it is central, because it asks whether growth can be called progress when its early benefits are unevenly distributed and its costs fall hardest on those with the least power to refuse them. If you stayed with me this far, you now have something far more valuable than a trivia answer, you have a way of thinking. Because the deepest lesson here is not about steam engines, it is about systems. Industrial revolutions ignite when incentives reward problem solving, when entry and experimentation are possible, and when the basic foundations, especially energy and institutions, make adoption and scaling economically rational. So the question to carry into the present is almost unsettlingly simple: what are our binding constraints today, and how many of them are truly physical limits versus limits created by policy, bureaucracy, or concentrated control? Another question: when do interventions genuinely help coordination, and when do they accidentally freeze experimentation by protecting certain players, locking in bad incentives, or shifting costs into places people do not immediately see? And perhaps the biggest question of all: how do we measure progress? Is it only output, or is it also freedom, dignity, and the ability for ordinary people to choose and create without asking permission? If you enjoyed this kind of thoughtful, entertaining history, go ahead and like the video, subscribe to Truth Behind History, and drop a comment with your take on the most surprising factor behind Britain's rise. Was it energy, wages, institutions, markets, or something else entirely? And if you want more stories where we peel back the official narrative and follow the incentives, the power structures, and the unintended consequences that quietly shape our world, explore the rest of the channel, because history gets a lot more interesting when you stop memorizing it and start interrogating it.